Thanks, Sonia, Charlie, Barbara, Martha, Michelle, for creating this wonderful space. To use a fashionable metaphor, I think you created a wonderful assemblage. Just leave it at that, with humans and non-humans of different kinds, and thinking different things. I'm going to, in the little time that we have, I'm going to talk about 4 different themes that I think are underlined in the 4 papers in different ways, different intensities. And that sort of is revealing why these 4 different themes as well. And then I'll make a comment about each one of the papers. And the first one is the questions about the nature of politics and the political. Okay? And obviously that came up in presentations today by Stellan, Barbara, Marisol, Michal, and Margaret's comments as well. So it's sort of aiming to continue to keep on pushing and rethinking this question. And as they appear in the papers, I think we can sort of talk about 2 different ways of thinking about them. One is the hegemonic form of politics that Tagatan talks about in his paper. Maybe we can say modernist forms of politics. The other is a whole series of other ways of thinking about politics, which we can call, I don't know, autonomous, relational, non-dualist, sort of the ontological vision of politics in a different way. The second set of points that I think we can highlight from these different papers is something about the relationship between the state and social movements. So the state and social movement nexus that continues to be so important for understanding at least Latin American transformations today. I think Robert's comment was to some extent about this, the relation between state, capital, and social movements, and summarized very well in the questions first in the paper by Tagatan. Okay. Okay. Can social movements occupy the state effectively? Can social movements occupy the space effectively? Which is sort of the dream of the left to some extent, and in a more open-ended way, but in George's paper, what happens to a Tahir government? In the political case of Venezuela, what happens to a Tahir government? Third set of questions about autonomy, which are connected to, obviously, to this one. Autonomy, how do we think autonomy within and beyond the state? And especially the emergence of a whole series of ways of thinking about non-state forms of social life, non-state forms of politics. And in my mind, and this is something that appears timidly in all of the papers, I've seen a little bit more in Rafael's papers and the other papers, which is the rise of something that we can call the communal form of politics. And that we can find in both intellectual and also in activist languages, including things like the communal system by Felix Pazzi, an Aymara intellectual, or communitarian feminisms by Julieta Paredes, another Aymara intellectual, but also in many other ways of talking about the communal, again, from Chiapas to Colombia, south of Colombia to the Andes as well. And the 4th set of questions are questions about the relationship between culture and politics. And going back again, as Marisol suggested, to the 1998 volume that Sonia, Evelina, and myself co-edited, in which we talked about the importance of understanding both the cultural dimension of the political and the political dimension of the cultural. And now, sort of in that formulation, I think we were aiming towards an ontological reading of that Marisol articulated today. Sort of how do we think about the ontological dimension of politics and the political dimension of the ontological of any kind of world in which we are. And certainly Marisol and Michal articulated that as well in their papers today. Now, something very quick about the papers. Tagatan. So, very quick formula. I mean, all of these will have to be discussed so much more. The hegemonic form of politics is good for thinking about success and popular insurrections, but it's not good for talking about failure, for thinking about failure. So when so-called movements fail, there is something else going on. And this is the lesson that we learn from many other kinds of readings of movements. They are about something else, and the something else they are about then is about these other ways of thinking about politics. We can call it autonomous, ontological, cultural, and so forth. And there's also a group of Aymara intellectuals thinking about this, but also people like Raquel Gutierrez Aguilar, Raúl Sibeki, and so forth, that are focusing on what is the productivity of these other non-liberal, non-state, non-capitalist forms of politics and social life that seem to have failed to reconstitute the social or the state of the economy, but nevertheless have had tremendous productivity. Raphael's paper, extractivism, extractivism, I think, is the single most important social, economic, and political fact today in Latin America. And it's a very complicated one. It's a very complex one. So neoliberal globalization, as Raphael suggests, and I agree with almost pretty much everything that Raphael writes, and all of the 3 papers are really worth reading at length. They are on their way of becoming full-length papers, so please do read the papers. So that neoliberal globalization is a cultural political project, is the way in which we usually put it, is an ontological occupation of territories and walls. So what resists also is, you can say, is sort of an ontological struggles for the defense of territories, cultures, walls, etc., etc. And I think what Raphael calls conflictos de alternativas, he says environmental conflicts, socio-environmental conflicts quite doesn't make it. I mean, we have to talk about something else than that. He calls them conflictos de alternativas, meaning by that conflictos over ways of life, over models of life, over walls and ontologies. And by people who live in the shadows of liberalism, but liberal diaspora, somebody calls them, but nevertheless, happen and succeed in living beyond just the liberal walls. And that points at what he calls, and many other people call now, the need for civilization and transitions. And we in the Academy of Social Theories might not like, for good reasons in many ways, the concept of civilization, of community, the communal. But I think there are ways in which they are emerging with really great interest and epistemic and nuance and complexity and force from the field of social movements in what I would call non-essentialist and fully historicized ways. So do not dismiss something when somebody writes about the communal civilization. Oh no, that's essentializing, that's homogenizing, that's romantic, utopian, idealist, localizing, what have you, or too generalizing, because I think there is something going on that is important to pay attention to there. And finally, in the 60 seconds that I have left, George, silencing of protest, the Caracazo. So how Barbara, I was remembering when I was a discussant at the last panel in which Barbara presented the paper, her paper, a version of the paper that she presented today. I sort of started by saying that is more than silencing protest. And I still remember sort of Sonia's wonderful laughter when I say this. It's about the silencing of life, period. The social theory really silences life. And I think what this group is about seeing again life, allowing life to erupt again through this way in which social theory has silenced not only political life and protest, but life in general. The notion of recuperated repertoires, I think, is a very interesting one. It's one that, as you will say as well, can be appropriated. And Julie's wonderful concept this morning, which talked about a transnational liberal toolkit, which is appropriated by world elites and governments and regimes selectively and appropriately to silence protest and to the re-liberalization of the language of protest of radical movements is also part of what is going on in Venezuela. You show it very well with the 2014 movements of the right, and which also explain why El Barrio didn't show up, as he puts it in his paper, in 2014, and explaining why El Barrio doesn't show up really requires, and this is my last point, a very significant engagement, sort of what Marisol was calling for today, ethnographic, historical reading of the complexity of what is really going on in the social natural fields of Latin America today. Thank you.
I think we have only time for a round of questions and answers now. So.
Yeah, and my suggestion, folks, is that I asked for the coffee to come back out. So when we're finished with questions, stretch quick, get coffee, come back. We'll do the next panel, and then we'll have plenty of relaxed time for nice hot food, cash bar, or whatever reception. Okay. So that's why we need to have
good.
Big food, wine, table.
So is the icebreaker here? Michal?
I thank you so much for Rich Paperson. Today my brain is like, So I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to discuss over the coming days. I just wanted to note that I think one of the striking absences, except perhaps in Rafael's paper, and I was wondering what this does, and it's really just a comment and an observation, and it's not meant critically in a harsh way, is just the absence of women and the movements of women, except for Rafael mentioning it sort of peripherally as in like the role of women has changed in the dissolution of organizations. Because for me in Latin America, you know, in addition to indigenous movements, the role of women, the connection of women to el territorio and is nature and various other things that are more, you know, not romantic, is absolutely crucial to understanding what is happening and what has happened. So, yeah. And there weren't women on the
So I think this is just additive because my question was sort of what feminist theory, and I know it does have, could bring to the politics of extractivism when so much of gender theory and feminist theory has been about extraction and taking what's not yours.
Anybody else? Yes?
I don't know if a question or maybe.
Can you stand up?
Okay. My concern is about the. If I need to continue thinking social movements in Latin America like a fragmentation struggles, or we need to transform that ideas of fragmentis and to think about more about that Professor Marisol was proposing before in terms of the concept of divergence. Thinking about that social movements in Latin America are the same interests, but at the same time there are different interests because the struggles are different. It's not to think about that the social movements in terms of indigenous movements or Afro-Colombian movements in that cases are fragmented because it's the constant discussions about these particular movements in Latin America. We need to think about more about that. There are many kind of indigenous movements and there are many kind of Afro-descendant movements in Latin America. We need to think about that all of those struggles are articulate and they are the same interest in terms of the divergence concept, but at the same time they are different. Not thinking about fragments. And this is my suggestion for Rafael that he used the first, even though the fragmentation of the social movement, think about more about this concept that I consider is very important in my particular research and part in terms of social movements. Also, I would like to know how Rafael defines more clearly the concept of dissidence, because he used the term dissidence when he was talking about the modern insurgent, powerful concern, political concerns about that the thing that criminalize us is being coherent with we were. And in this particular moment was not clear to me the way in which you understand or you define the terms dissidence in Latin America. In the same directions, I would like to know what is your opinions about this, the differentiations also between the ways in which the criminalization of the protests on the social movements, on the grassroots struggle is different in every case in Latin America, because it's not the same the context, for example, in Colombia, that we are historical armed conflict, and the context right now, for example, in Ecuador, that also was affected by the armed conflict in Colombia, but it's different, the situations in every particular places. So,
okay, thanks. Yeah, two more.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot already.
Okay. So, well, let's go in order. Yeah. See. But you know, take 1 minute each, because we are...
Quick, okay. I think, just to respond very quickly on the question of gender, yeah, it's massively important, and it cross-cuts movements on both sides of these things. And I think it's a mistake to, I think it's a mistake to kind of overly gender tactical approaches in the way that is often done, to say that rioting is masculinist. But I will say that the barricades in February and March were very gendered. And at the same time, you also had, in this overlaps with race in a whole bunch of ways, in the places that it started. In Táchira has a certain kind of identity, which is a racialized identity. It's a very sort of like, also kind of a macho identity, so that you actually had women on protests wearing sort of fake testicles, and carrying signs that said Los Gochos, which is kind of the identity of the area, Los Gochos tienen bolas. And so, you know, the Gochos have balls. And so this is a very funny way in which, and that is not at all separable from this question of extraction, right? Because the idea is we have lost something that belongs to us, namely the country, and then we are the rightful rulers of it, and then when we want to take it back from, you know, from these poor, you know, people that have stolen it from us.
See, I have 1 minute for 5 questions, so that's like 12 seconds each. No, I just wanted to respond to 2 things. Maybe the question of dissidence, and there I'm going to use Spanish because I just can't express myself with sufficient subtlety in English on the issue. So, in Spanish one could entender que disidencia viene de 2 palabras distintas, ¿no? Una, disentir, which is feel different, no? Or you don't agree with hegemony or status quo. But the other word is decidir, which is apart yourself from the current situation. So I think what's happening in these practices of criminalization is that both kind of practices are getting criminalized. If you see the kind of legal cases against social movement practices in Peru, it's very interesting to see that organizing a referendum is being criminalized, even with laws about terrorism, you know what I mean? So it's not protest that's being criminalized. What's being criminalized is the capacity to live, think, act, organize differently than the status quo is imposing on ourselves. And that's materializing in different ways according to the geo-historical context of each country. For example, in Ecuador, over the last 20 years, even 4 governments, I think, fall, and there has been like 1 or 2 deaths in the repression of all of these protests. In Peru, in 10 years, we have 200. I think this issue of understanding how criminalization works in each geo-historical issue context is very important, especially for Colombia, as Colombia is going to this post-agreement situation in which violence, repression, and criminalization is going to be re-articulated, reorganized, in a situation in which there is no open war. And I think that the dialogue with Peru is very, very interesting because we went through that process, and probably one of the reasons why in Colombia there are conditions for peace now is because the expansion of mining needs the pacification of the country. That's what happened in Peru as well. And then on gender, just one issue, I think one thing is talking about the role of women, and we can talk a lot more about this. And I think that we have to take care not to essentialize or romanticize, but there's a very, very big role for women in the conflicts. But the other thing is more the perspective Zivecki offered of the feminization of politics, which has to do with incorporating traditional female values in the ways in which we organize politics, and that has to do also with the relation with nature. And again, we shouldn't essentialize, but the idea of nurturing and guarding, which is in the Los Guardianes de las Lagunas muy presente in their discourse, I think that's very interesting, and that's something very new in terms of practices and in terms of discourse, horizons of change that's searching. And in that sense, the indigenous movement, indigenous women, can be right that the Pachakutik is announcing a time in which the female ethic is going to be dominant in politics, but then again, we shouldn't romanticize and essentialize here. Thanks.
Okay, 1 minute is quite less, but I'll just try to address most of the comments. Okay, firstly, on the value of politics that does not succeed. Yes, they do have value, and for me, the value lies in the fact that they actually show in practice how an alternative to the neoliberal, modernist, statist form of social organization, right? An alternative is possible and it exists, and we are already practicing it. But then my problem is that, especially for the people who are in struggle, it's not just a question of intrinsic value or showing the world that an alternative model is possible. For them, it's also a question of survival. And what happened, especially with the Tipunese protesters, is that finally, now before the elections, because they couldn't form this alliance against the government, what they did is finally a lot of them ended up aligning with the old neoliberal right wing. And the major leaders are supporting the neoliberal politicians, and that's not because they believe in neoliberal politics, but they feel that that's the only way they can prevent the road from being built. That's the only way they can defend themselves from from the developmental projects of the government, which will take over their collective territories. So I would say that instead of seeing intrinsic value in certain experiments, what we need to do is also to multiply those experiments and to multiply politics that's outside the hegemony of modernity. But to be able to multiply it, we need to neutralize power. So once state power is neutralized, once you have state power and then you try to create these non-state forms of social organization, then you neutralize state power. Otherwise, what would happen is the state could step in any time and take it over. I'm just referring to one of Charlie's comments on Escobar's article. I don't know if he still holds by that, but basically he argues that the kind of politics which Dr. Escobar proposes would lead to an image of tiny islands of decolonial practice in the vast ocean of business as usual, neoliberal business as usual. And that's not necessarily outside the neoliberal repertory. And what I feel is that most of the cases, I would say the state hasn't intervened, or the state hasn't intervened with total coercion, because these small experiments did not challenge neoliberalism as much as it would if those experiments multiplied, because capital could fly, right? So if you have the Zapatistas, and capital could fly to other parts of Mexico or any other part of the world. But if such experiments multiply, and if we have, if there are if the experiment of the Zapatistas and other decolonial practices multiply all over the world to challenge neoliberal capitalism and their markets, I'm sure that neoliberal governments would intervene, even militarily, to control and create that space. So I would say that, instead of just finding intrinsic value in that politics, we need to multiply those politics. We need to multiply those decolonial spaces which practice a different kind of politics. And to do that, we need to neutralize power. And turning one's back on state power and pretending that it does not exist is not the way to do that.
And on those words, we will now take a quick break.